Welcome to The Nameless. This story is not for everyone, but if you're still here, take a deep breath. Let's begin.
Every tick sounded like a whisper saying my name. I remembered noticing it before I noticed anything else. The way the sound slid under the normal noises of the house. The refrigerator hum, the distant traffic, the air moving through the vents. Beneath all of it was the ticking. Slow, careful, intimate. It felt closer than it should have, like it was happening inside my head instead of across the room. I lay there on the couch, staring at the ceiling fan, telling myself I was half asleep and mishearing things. But every time the clock ticked, I felt my attention pulled toward it, like someone gently tapping my shoulder over and over again. At the time, the clock had already been in my apartment for a week. I lived alone in a one-bedroom place above a closed-down bakery on the edge of town. It was the kind of building that smelled faintly sweet no matter how long it had been abandoned, like sugar baked into the walls. I worked a normal office job, nothing stressful, nothing strange. My routine was solid. Work, gym, microwave dinner, bed. I wasn't someone who went looking for weird experiences, and I didn't believe in cursed objects or anything like that. If you'd asked me back then, I would have said I believed in coincidences and bad wiring. The clock came from my aunt's house. She'd passed away suddenly, and since I was the closest relative nearby, I was asked to help clean out her place. She collected antiques the way some people collect mugs or magnets. Every surface had something old and heavy on it. I didn't want most of it, but I felt bad leaving everything to be sold off or thrown away. The clock stood in the corner of her living room, tall and narrow, dark wood polished smooth by time. It wasn't especially beautiful, but it had presence. The face was simple, with slightly yellowed numbers and thin black hands. When I touched it, the ticking stopped. I remembered pulling my hand back, feeling a little embarrassed even though no one was watching. A few seconds later, the ticking started again. I told myself it was pressure on the casing, nothing more. When I asked the estate guy about it, he shrugged and said it worked fine last he checked. I took it home mostly out of guilt. It felt wrong to leave it behind. The first couple of days were normal enough. I put the clock in my living room near the window. It kept time well, maybe a little too well. I noticed the ticking was louder than my other clocks, but old mechanisms were like that. At night, I started closing the living room door so I wouldn't hear it while I slept. That was when I realized it was counting backward. I didn't notice all at once. It was small things. I'd glance at the clock and feel a brief moment of confusion, like my brain had skipped a beat. Once, I could have sworn it said 4:12 when my phone said 4:15. I checked again a minute later, and the clock said 4:11. I laughed it off, assuming I'd misread it. When I stood there watching it, the second hand moved forward like normal. No dramatic reversal, just steady ticking. Still, the feeling stuck with me. Over the next few days, I started checking it more often. Every time I did, it was slightly behind. Not broken behind, not frozen, just off by a few minutes. I adjusted it twice. Each time, within hours, it lagged again. I told myself it needed servicing. Old clocks drift. But the whispering sound started around then. It wasn't words, not really. More like the idea of my name, shaped by the ticking. I'd be in the kitchen, and the sound would thread its way through the clink of dishes and the running water. I'd stop what I was doing and listen. The ticking felt heavier in those moments, like it carried weight. I caught myself responding once, quietly saying, "Yeah?" to an empty apartment. That was when I unplugged the clock. The ticking didn't stop. It took me a second to process that. I stood there holding the cord, staring at the outlet. The sound kept going, unchanged. I remember feeling embarrassed again, as if the clock had caught me doing something foolish. I plugged it back in. The ticking continued, exactly the same. That night, I dreamed about standing in my aunt's living room. Everything was just as it had been before she died, except the clock was louder. Each tick echoed. When I leaned closer, I realized the numbers on the face weren't numbers anymore. They were dates. All of them were in the past. I woke with my heart racing, but no sense of panic. Just a heavy calm, like the dream had drained something out of me. When I checked the clock, it read 6:02. My phone said 6:07. I started keeping notes after that. Nothing formal, just little timestamps in my phone. When I left for work, when I came home, what the clock said versus everything else. The difference kept growing. 5 minutes became 10, 10 became 20. It didn't jump. It slid backward at a steady, patient pace. Other things started slipping too. I missed a meeting because I left late, trusting the clock without thinking. A pot boiled dry because I waited for a timer that never seemed to reach zero. I felt like I was always a step behind my own life, like I was walking through rooms after everyone else had already left. Friends commented that I seemed distracted. I agreed and laughed, but inside I felt oddly detached, like my reactions were delayed. One evening, I noticed the clock had stopped ticking. The silence was worse than the sound. I stood in the living room holding my breath. After maybe 10 seconds, the ticking resumed. I swear the first tick after the pause sounded closer than before, like it had moved while I wasn't looking. That night, I heard my name clearly. It wasn't loud. It didn't echo. It sounded like someone speaking from another room, just loud enough to register. It came with the tick. Each tick pressed the sound into my awareness. My name, over and over, stretched thin and breathy. I sat on the edge of my bed until my legs went numb, listening. I didn't sleep. The next day, I tried to get rid of the clock. I carried it down the stairs and put it in my car. As I drove, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see it tipping over or moving on its own. I pulled into a donation center parking lot and lifted it out. The ticking was loud in the open air. A woman at the door smiled at me and reached for it. When her hands touched the wood, the ticking stopped. She frowned and shook it slightly. "I think this one's broken," she said. The ticking started again. Her smile faded just a bit. "I'll just take it back," I said quickly. She didn't argue. On the drive home, I noticed the radio clock flicker. It went blank for a second, then came back on. It was 5 minutes behind. I left the antique clock in my trunk overnight. In the morning, I felt lighter, like a pressure had lifted. My apartment was quiet in a normal way. No whispering, no ticking threaded through everything. I made coffee and stood there enjoying the sound of it brewing, realizing how tense I'd been. Then I checked my phone. It said 7:40. I was already late. I ran outside and opened my trunk. The clock was still there, still ticking. The time on its face read 7:12. I don't know why I did what I did next. I didn't think it through. I just knew I needed it gone.
I drove out of town, past the familiar streets, until the buildings thinned and the road narrowed. There was an old landfill area that had been closed for years, overgrown and forgotten. I parked near a rusted fence and carried the clock through the weeds. The ground was soft from recent rain, normal. The relief lasted until the next morning. I woke up before my alarm, disoriented. The apartment felt wrong, not threatening, just misaligned. I checked my phone. The date was correct, but the time didn't make sense. It was earlier than it should have been, earlier than when I'd gone to bed. I heard the ticking.
It came from the living room. The clock stood exactly where it had always been, clean and dry, not a speck of dirt on it. The time read 6:03. My phone said 6:15. I stood there staring at it, waiting for fear to hit me. It didn't. What I felt was resignation, a tired acceptance, like I'd finally understood a rule I'd been breaking without knowing it. The whispering came back, softer than before. Not just my name this time, but fragments of moments. A laugh from a conversation I half remembered. The sound of my aunt calling me in for dinner years ago.
The tick followed each sound, steady and patient. I realized then that the clock wasn't counting time, it was counting me. Not my age or my hours, but my presence. Each tick felt like a step backward through my own memories, through the version of myself that existed in each moment. I started to notice gaps, things I knew had happened but couldn't picture anymore. A vacation I couldn't recall the end of, a friend's face blurring around the edges. I stopped trying to get rid of the clock. I started avoiding it instead. I kept my eyes on my phone, on my computer, on anything that told time the right way. I left the apartment more. I stayed late at work. When I came home, the clock always read earlier than when I'd left. The difference grew faster now. Sometimes, late at night, I'd catch the whispering change. It didn't always sound like my name anymore. Sometimes it sounded like someone else's voice, trying on mine. I moved out 3 months later. I didn't take the clock with me. The landlord called a week after I left to ask about it. He said the new tenant complained about the noise. I told him to throw it away. He laughed and said it was too nice for that. Now, years later, I still think about it. Every so often, I'll wake up convinced I've lost time. I'll check every clock in the room, making sure they agree. Sometimes, for just a second, I hear a familiar ticking under everything else, and I feel that gentle pull on my attention. I've learned not to listen too closely, because every time I do, I get the sense that something is still counting backward, patiently waiting for me to catch up.